Hello, I'm OmnusI, your game master this evening here in my lair. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, I am Rob here in the Lair of OmnusI, and this is going to be a supplementary episode of Lair of OmnusI 19. Call it 19.33. In 19, OmnusI covered the basics of the Shadowrun collection that we have. In this video, I'm going to talk about aspects of Shadowrun that I think need a little bit more elaborating on than just the layer covered. In its brevity, kind of missed out on a few things of why Shadowrun itself is so important to me. So, a couple things. First of all, Shadowrun was the first game system that I played that used a mechanic of rolling multiple dice and considering the dice that hit a particular target number to determine how effective your attempt at doing something was. This is a mechanic that I've seen since then. White Wolf's original series comes to mind, but it was quite revolutionary. The whole game and being good meant getting as many dice as possible, be that from attributes, be that from skills, or be that from the gear that you would use. Maybe there were enhancements like cybernetics or different magical buffs that you could also get, but that was the key point of it. If you were good, you rolled lots of dice. If you weren't good, you prayed that the dice gods were on your side and all of your dice came up good. Clever game masters would find ways to keep you off your stride and occasionally have you doing things you weren't really good at, to point out flaws and make you want to improve your character in other ways. So, how is that important? Well, number one, as I said, every new mechanic that you learn kind of teaches you something new about games and probabilities and things like that. You could find out that sometimes being really good and throwing a lot of dice, if you were trying something really tricky, the target number was so high. Original Shadowrun, the number could scale up and down depending on how hard what you were trying to do was. So if you had a very high target number, say the power of your weapon was high, and you rolled, you could have a rather difficult time, even with lots of dice, of landing enough successes to matter. If you kept the target number low, but you had low skill, your dice might go south and you might have a difficult time getting the successes that you're looking for. So it's a balancing act of trying to do things to mitigate a high target number while fitting into your wheelhouse where you have a lot of dice to throw. And then that's where you could have your epic successes and the things that you're supposed to be very good at. So I believe the system deserves recognition for that. I'm not saying they're the first ones to invent it. My knowledge of role-playing games that have been out and about is not so great that I assume I know everything about role-playing games that have ever been out. But as far as my formative years in gaming, that was a pretty significant change. Prior to that, it was Dungeons and Dragons, where you would roll and you would look at a table, or you would quickly figure out your THAC0 and figure out if your target number was good enough with one die. One die that covers a larger spectrum. And, your damage was dealt if you hit with a totally different die. In Shadowrun, the more successes you had when you hit somebody, subtracting successes that they had for their successful dodge, drove your damage up. there was a power level that was what your opponent had to roll to resist damage. If that was high, the damage that you rolled was probably going to stick. The letter rating was how much damage the weapon did by default. Very weak weapons did only light damage. Extremely lethal military weapons could do all the way up to deadly damage, meaning that if you hit, somebody was in a lot of trouble. The final number was staging, which was a number of successes that you needed to hit to drive the damage code up by a level. It also represented the number of successes that your defender had to take to bring the damage down so that he could absorb and soak it. Which meant that you had two different schools. You had weapons that had really high power and maybe not a lot of staging, so that you could count on your opponent not being able to resist the damage as much. Or you had weapons with a lot of staging, which meant that your opponent would have to have lots and lots of successes in order to bring the damage down. Numbers with high power and high staging, deadly. You're talking about your larger machine guns and assault cannons and things like that. So figuring out which numbers were better was a balancing act. And a lot of the fine-tuning of the characters involved basically cost and risk assessment. If your character was brilliant with machine guns, well, when you finally had to go on a Shadowrun where you couldn't bring heavy hardware with you, all those points were not going to be used unless you were going to be very creative about things. However, if you had pistols as your specialty, you might be able to tote them just about anywhere. But if a particularly large troll wearing combat armor was coming your way, there weren't very many weapons that were going to hurt it that were pistol-sized. So, that was kind of the act. A good Shadowrunner covered most of their bases. They would have usually something for larger scale foes, and they would specialize in weapons that fit their particular niche within their group. Now, that was one big mechanic that Shadowrun had. Its core mechanic, as a matter of fact. Now, later versions of Shadowrun, like fourth, maybe fifth, changed their tack. Instead of having a scaling target number, all of a sudden, 5s and 6s were what you needed. Those counted as hits. And instead of a scaling target number, instead you had a threshold. You need to get so many successes in order to truly succeed. The more difficult the target that you're aiming for, whatever it is you want to do, the higher the threshold was, meaning you needed more successes to get there. And if you didn't have enough, it wasn't going to come off as well as you wanted it. And if you completely pooched, well, you glitched, and that brings its own problems. Is that system as elegant? It's certainly a bit simpler. Honestly, when you can roll the dice and you can immediately parse out all the numbers that were 2s, 3s, and 4s, just get rid of those. Contrast how many 1s you got, because if you got so many 1s, you could have a glitch, and if they were mostly 1s, you could have a critical glitch. And then 5s and 6s, you count those and you find out how many hits you have. You report that to the Game Master. The Game Master only has to tell you what you're rolling against. Is it an attribute and a skill? Maybe a pair of attributes that are equally important to that particular venture. And you just count up the numbers you have and roll. Some things were in pools. We covered pools. But really, what a pool is it's a diminishing resource that you can have, that you can draw from to attempt to succeed at something. And many of the things in the original Shadowrun were almost all reactive pools. If you were going to dodge, it had a pool so that if you were having to dodge multiple threats, you could break that up to try to deal with that kind of a threat. In Magic, it was also resource budgeting. You take your magical reserves and either would use it to cushion the blow of drain from casting a spell. Maybe you would use it to enhance an elemental that you had fighting for you, or a spirit. Maybe you would use it to help your friends not be as messed up when a hostile spell comes their way. It was actually, quite clever and a bit of an art figuring out how to budget how you're going to use your pool for the round. And then, once your turn comes around again, your pool refreshes and you're back to your capacity. There were hacking pools for those who ran the Matrix. And that was, these are the kind of things that I thought were very innovative. I enjoyed those differences that made it something other than Dungeons and Dragons. Not the saving throws, that it's all or nothing. Not the class increases where all of your improvements come at once and you can fight on until you're practically dead at no detriment. Shadowrun was a bit more realistic. Was you took damage, either your target numbers went up, or I believe your thresholds got bigger. Either way, you were going to have a harder time doing what you wanted to do when you got banged up. Shadowrun also had two different health pools. They had your health and then your mental pool, which represented how much you could take before you get knocked out. If you were casting low-level magics, for example, drain was mental. You could pass out from casting a spell. Unarmed combat, concussive weapons, some electrical attacks, they would end up doing mental damage, which not as dangerous. Physical damage is what'll kill you. You run out of your physical bar and you're done. You better hope Dock Wagon is on their way, because you're going to die soon. If your mental pool spills over, you take physical damage. You basically suffer a stroke if you take too much damage to your neurons and everything, or some sort of aneurysm or embolism or something that'll kill you. So that was interesting. A little bit more realistic than some of the role-playing games that I had been used to up to that point. And then, of course, you still have the fantasy element, which I love. You have guns, you have cool vehicles, you have corporations, the kind of things that you're kind of used to today that you could encounter. But then you've got orcs, and trolls, and dwarves, and elves. The elves have their own nation of snooty grass huggers. You have orcs that are just they try to live in the margins, and they're notoriously tough. You have trolls who are known for being dim-witted but mighty. You have dwarves who are known for, being rather tough, stubborn. Many of the fantasy traits, are kind of assumed in the year 2050. If you're an elf, you're going to be a certain way. If you're a troll, you're going to be a certain way. And a lot of the character classes and archetypes, as I remember right, were kind of turning those stereotypes on their head. Sure, your street samurai is going to be a grizzled warrior of the streets with some cyberware and stuff to make them extra tough and a stash of guns. But you had things like a troll mage. A troll who has diminished mental capacity, a cap on their attributes for mental abilities. Being a mage seems counterintuitive. You'll never get the biggest pools you can get because your brains just don't work that well. On the other hand, having a mage who is nearly bulletproof because they have thick hide and a large stat that allows them to soak up bullets, not a bad thing altogether. It certainly makes somebody not go by the stereotypes in their response. If somebody thinks, oh no, it's a troll, I better get out the things that help me, and the troll suddenly throws out a fireball or a mana ball, that could really ruin the plans of somebody who doesn't know your party's capabilities as well. So that was I always thought that was kind of funny. That whole idea with a troll mage, for the most part, I never really went against that kind of stereotype as much, although I have seen it done successfully a few times. It led to some interesting characters. I'm not going to say the most optimized, but interesting. Now, one thing about Shadowrun that always kind of makes me cringe a little bit inside, and I didn't go over this in Lair level 19, is Shadowrun, more than any other game I've ever played, slices up adventures and kind of forces your players to work solo in the middle of a group run. I'm going to explain that. Your group can be going together on a run. No problem. But there's the site. Well, your mage is going to go astral to see if there's any magical threats. Okay, well, nobody else can do that, so your mage does that. Say there are some threats that have to be dealt with. The most convenient way is not to do it through spells, but go astral and take care of the situation. That character is the only one who can do that. And there are a couple of kind of lame workarounds, but for the most part, astral stuff, only mages can do that. Only mages can go there, and machine guns aren't going to help a whole lot against that elemental if an elemental activates and comes after you. So, yeah, that mage has his own world and those things that only he's going to be able to do. Anybody can pull a trigger, but when you get into the fighting aspect, everybody's going to have their own specialty. Some people won't have any specialty, possibly. If you have a group that has a face character, he may not be all that great in a fight. If you have a decker, they probably have pumped all of their resources into their decking skills, their hacking, their cyberware, and such. They may not have a lot to do much more than pew pew, duck for cover, pew pew. Maybe on a lucky shot they might injure an opponent. Obviously, this is assuming a fair amount with the stereotypes. You can make a huge range of characters, but it's rare when you're going to find somebody who's as good as they could possibly be in their field, who isn't leaving many of the rest of the game behind. But anybody can shoot a gun. The cyber warriors, the street samurai, the what have you, are going to dominate that world, however. The only ones who can kind of bridge is you're very rarely going to have a decker who's going to completely dominate in a fight, unless he brings his toys along. Now, they have, especially in later editions, really come along with drones and letting riggers be able to use drones to even the odds, and deckers to some extent to be able to even the odds. They can stay safely behind out of a fight, and if their drones get shot up, their frail flesh has not been shot up, so that's a good. But in the combat theater, the street samurais are usually going to grab most of the headlines there. Now, let's just say a standard Shadowrun, you get inside the objective. Alarms go off. You don't want the security to know where you're at, because then your job gets much harder. Time to call the decker. The decker can jack in and do a quick matrix run to try to shut off the alarms, to try to blow the security cameras so that the opponents may not know where their current location is, or maybe throw in some disinformation to throw off pursuit to make their jobs even easier. Well, the decker's the only one who can do that. The others have to watch his body while he goes off and takes care of the problem. Again, the Matrix is an exciting place. There's intrusion countermeasures. There's hostile deckers. There's all kinds of encounters that you can have in Astral or in the Matrix. But only that character, or those characters if you have multiple deckers. But those are the only characters that can do anything related to that field. It's divided up again. You have all these areas that only those characters can really do well or at all. So the deckers can pretty much have their little slice of the pie. The mages have their own world. And everybody can kind of fight, but the people who are really good at it are going to be in the center. Now, I've always had a hard time grappling with that, to the point that when I run Shadowrun, usually people who have those special abilities do their stuff on the side, or I simplify those kind of encounters. For the most part, I haven't had a problem with it, but it does cheap out on the experience for those who have specialized skills. I would love to have grand astral safaris and journeys, but my Shadowrunners are usually mixed up with more meat than magic. Same goes with the Matrix. The Matrix is an amazing construct. But for those people who have the skills, when they bring anybody else along, it's usually just wearing goggles and not being able to do hardly anything. Really, in order to make those characters as special in their particular world, it's hard. You can have a meeting in cyberspace where everybody's goggled in. If you're going to have a run where there's actual opposition, only those people who are really good at that kind of thing get up, are really going to shine. Everyone else is going to kind of slog along. There are, of course, if you are determined, there are ways around that. You can give those people who can't jack in, you can give them some sort of rig that allows them to simulate it, probably at a significant penalty to the people who are actually plugging their brains into the Matrix. Astral space is even harder. Doing things, I showed you I have the Grimoire. The Grimoire has these wonderful ideas for, traveling out into the realms and astral projection. Again, it's not inclusive. It's very specific to those characters with those kind of talents and abilities that they've paid for with their characters. They've paid for them with their initial character spending points. They've paid for them with their lack of skills in other areas that the other characters enjoy. So it almost seems a shame not to allow them to kind of plunge into those worlds. But oftentimes those just kind of get glossed over. Oh, you want to go and get information from the Umbra. Go ahead and make a few rolls. Okay, you can get that information. So that's one of the challenges of running Shadowrun. If you can come to grips with it, if you can kind of embrace the division and find a way to reconcile it, as I said, perhaps get those kind of players some private time so that they can work through those scenarios. If you have a matrix grid and layout where the decker can go and you can let him run his little adventure through it, complete with combat, with intrusion countermeasures and what have you, and then kind of say, all right, well, we already did this outside of the game, so now he plugs in. A few moments later, his eyelids flutter and he comes back to real space with a big smile on his face. Or he comes crashing with smoke coming out of his ears, with clearly in a Matrix dump shock. That's a way that I have handled it in the past. May not be the best way, and it's certainly not the most convenient way. But when you are trying to come to grips with a game that, again, has these hard barriers that makes it very difficult for your characters to penetrate from one world to another, you have to come up with some clever ideas. And for those of you who are, designing a game, I've always felt that was something that kind of held back Shadowrun a little bit, because it is difficult. I have 30 years of game mastering experience, and that's a riddle that I haven't completely solved. I have workarounds for it. But as far as a way of making it, intuitive and easy to throw all of these different experiences and be fair to everybody about giving them their time, it's hard. Probably the hardest game that I run on a regular basis, being able to give everybody a fair experience in it. Dungeons & Dragons, easy. Even if you're playing a character that isn't combat intensive, you can usually do something to help out in the engagement. If you're an early level wizard in Dungeons & Dragons, at least you can throw daggers, and you're got probably close to the same chance to hit as anybody else in the group. Later on, you'll shine. There's always that sense that you're moving up towards improving something. Your mage, of course, can really be impressive in a battle in Shadowrun. But once that decker plugs into the wall, the mage can't do anything. Obviously, you want to have different things going on at the same time, but that does start to feel trite after a while. You hit that point, well, okay, the decker's going to rig in, so we're going to have to stop the waves after waves of bad guys from attacking him while he's plugged in. That's exciting for a run or two, sure. Artificial timetables and things like that. Splitting up the party, that can be interesting, challenge in its own right. But, Shadowrun has those unique challenges. It does give you some amazing opportunities, but those challenges do exist. So, as far as having those vistas, Shadowrun's a wonderful game. I do like both sets of the mechanics, both the older set with a floating target number, the newer set counting successes and hits. I think that the worlds have been curated very well. I think Seattle holds up quite well, and the Awakened world is still just as exciting and vibrant as ever. I've backed the Shadowrun Returns and Shadowrun Online Kickstarters. I believe in that world so much, and I was happy to see how good the Shadowrun Returns was, even though I still can't beat it. Damn, that last mission is hard. Yeah, I haven't beat it yet. I will. Shadowrun Online is okay. I thought it needed a lot of polish, and I honestly haven't played it in quite a while, so I'm hoping it's better. Maybe I'll have to run it a little bit tomorrow. But that's really my take on the appeal of Shadowrun. The world is amazing. The whole history, presidents being assassinated, dragons taking a part in politics, corporations run by a dragon, horrible, almost alien bug spirits taking over Chicago. You have corporations that are mind-bogglingly, sometimes just evil. As Technology seems like this horrible corporation based on ancient Mayan magic, where you have blood rituals and sacrifices and the worst things that you can imagine of the stereotypes. Alongside bearing in mind that As Technology is full of people who are just 9 to 5 wage earners. Nothing evil about them. They're earning a living in labs and service industries related to the corporation. There's a tendency in some cases to make some of the villains cartoonish. Shadowrun works better in shades of gray. You don't want your characters to wear the white hats all the time. You have to understand, your characters are oftentimes killers for money. And sometimes you don't want to save the world. Sometimes you just want to let it burn. The characters from a particular Shadowrun game that I ran were some of the most evil, vile characters I've ever had as my players. I remember when they cut off an orc's leg and beat him near to death with it, interrogating him in some coffin motel. Horrific stuff they would describe exactly what they were doing. It got the effect they were looking for. One of the medic of the group tried his hand at organ legging. That's removing victims' organs so that he can sell them on the black market. Just some really ghoulish ideas. The characters had very few what I would call redeeming qualities. But the players loved those nights. They loved living vicariously through those characters. And the world of Shadowrun is a world that you can do that. You can explore what it means to be somebody who doesn't value life and has powers well and beyond a normal person, completely unchained to do what you will. Except, of course, the world has consequences. You have law enforcement. You eventually have the government if you're bad enough. But there's almost always knight errant or corp security or what have you that will love to throw you in jail, or even better in one of my games, throw you in jail and then the corps tell you, you have to do what we want you to do or you don't get out. That led to some interesting stuff. They actually, in one game, had to whore themselves out as reality TV stars in a show called Runners, with a Z because that made it edgier. So they were forced to showcase all of the Ares bought out their term of imprisonment. So they had to use all of Ares' hottest new weapons and stuff to show it off on this reality show, where they would do running for cash. It was fun. It was a wonderful little storyline. If you run a Shadowrun game and you want to have fun with that, the parties get thrown into corporate jail. Enjoy. It's a great get out of jail free when you've got explosive collars on or a Cortex bomb that Ares can just go, oh, you didn't do what we wanted you to. Too bad. So that was a lot of fun. I have a lot of good memories of Shadowrun. The difficulties with inclusiveness and everything, that's one thing. But there's so many different avenues and good stories that are available. I'll tell you this, I also borrowed heavily from Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash book in my particular take on Shadowrun. I figured with the Mafia being public, it was a great kind of dark near-future story with its own matrix. That I borrowed things like, for example, if anybody deals with Mafia, the Mafia are an open experience in Shadowrun. They're a very poorly hidden secret. Well, every time somebody goes to Seattle and they have a contact in the Mafia, it's probably going to be Uncle Enzo from Neil Stephenson's wonderful book. If you haven't read it, I strongly suggest it. So this is why I love Shadowrun. Next, I'll get into the actual books themselves, why I selected those, what I like in a particular supplemental book, and maybe that'll help you a little bit learn more about me. So, I'm Rob here at the Lair of OmnusI, thanking you for listening to me rattle on about Shadowrun, and maybe this has taught you a little bit. Maybe this has whetted your appetite for a new game. Run through the shadows, chummer? Yes, please. Safe travels.